when my daughter slammed her ultimatum on the kitchen table like a judge's gavel. "You better start respecting my husband or you'll end up on the street." I felt the last thread of obligation snap inside me like an overstretched guitar string. Decades of sacrifice, of silent giving and unspoken love, collapsing into this single breathtaking moment of ingratitude. I smiled, not the broken smile of a defeated parent, but the quiet, knowing smile of someone who had just been handed the key to their own liberation. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady as granite, "for making this so much easier than I expected." 3 days later, when the eviction notice arrived at their apartment and her husband's unemployment benefits ran dry, my phone started ringing. I let it go to voicemail. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. The coffee ring on my granite countertop gleamed like an accusation in the morning light. I'd asked 3 times this week, politely I thought, for everyone to use coasters, small thing, reasonable request in your own home. Ronan wandered into the kitchen around noon, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled t-shirt, hair pointing in directions that defied physics. He grabbed my favorite mug, the one Vivienne had given me for Father's Day 5 years ago, and poured himself coffee without a word. "Morning," I said, watching him set the hot mug directly onto the granite again. He grunted something that might have been a greeting, eyes already glued to his phone screen. Gaming sounds drifted up from the device, some battle royale nonsense that had apparently become his full-time occupation since the temporary layoff 4 months ago. "There are coasters right there," I said, nodding toward the ceramic discs I'd arranged neatly beside the coffee maker. Ronan looked up slowly, his expression shifting from bored indifference to something colder. "Are you seriously micromanaging my coffee routine right now?" The word micromanaging hit wrong. I'd built this kitchen with my own hands, chosen every fixture, paid for every upgrade. Asking someone to use a coaster wasn't micromanaging. It was basic respect. "I'm just asking you to protect the countertop," I said, keeping my voice level. "It's not unreasonable." "You know what's unreasonable?" Ronan straightened, and I could see him warming to whatever argument he'd been rehearsing. Living in a house where you can't relax because someone's always watching, always criticizing, always finding problems with everything you do. The accusation stung because it was so backwards. He was the one sprawled across my furniture for 12 hours a day, eating my food, using my utilities, contributing nothing while I walked on eggshells to avoid the daily explosions that had become routine. "I'm not criticizing," I said. "I'm asking for basic consideration." "Basic consideration?" Ronan's voice rose. "Like the basic consideration of not making your daughter's husband feel like a criminal in his own home?" His own home. There it was again, that casual assumption of ownership that had been creeping into their conversations, as if 6 months of free room and board had somehow transferred the deed. "This isn't your home, Ronan," I said quietly. "It's mine, and I'm asking." "Damn it." He slammed the mug down, coffee splashing across the granite. "There it is. The truth finally comes out. This is my house. These are my rules, and you better remember you're just a guest." "Is that it?" I felt my jaw clench. "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said. And you know what? I'm tired of pretending this passive-aggressive bullshit is normal. You can't stand that Vivienne chose me. You can't handle that she has a life that doesn't revolve around you anymore." The words hit like physical blows, not because they were true, but because of how completely wrong they were. I'd welcomed him into this family, into this house. I'd bitten my tongue through months of watching him treat my daughter like a personal assistant while contributing nothing to their shared life. "That's not," I started. "Dad?" Vivienne's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. She stood in the doorway, hair still messy from sleep, but her eyes were alert, scanning the scene with the precision of someone who'd heard raised voices and come to investigate. Relief flooded through me. Finally, someone reasonable. Someone who knew me well enough to see through Ronan's manipulation. "Your husband seems to think asking for coasters is an attack on his character," I said, attempting a smile. But Vivienne wasn't looking at me with understanding. She was looking at Ronan with concern, her brow furrowed in the way it always was when she thought someone was being treated unfairly. "What happened?" she asked, moving to stand beside Ronan, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of automatic support that made my chest tighten. "Your dad's having another episode," Ronan said, his voice suddenly weary, as if he were the long-suffering victim of months of abuse. "Can't drink coffee without getting a lecture about respect and property damage." Episode. Like I was having some kind of breakdown for asking someone to use a coaster in my own kitchen. Vivian's eyes shifted to me, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Not confusion or curiosity, but disappointment. As if she'd already decided who was at fault before hearing my side. "Dad," Vivian said, her voice carrying that patient tone usually reserved for handling difficult children. "We've talked about this. You can't keep picking fights over every little thing. Every little thing. Like asking someone to use a coaster. Like expecting basic courtesy in my own home." "I'm not picking fights," I said carefully. "I asked him to use a coaster. That's not unreasonable." "But it's how you ask," she continued, moving fully into the kitchen now, positioning herself between Ronan and me like a referee. "It's the tone, the attitude. You make him feel unwelcome." The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. I was making him feel unwelcome in my house while he contributed nothing, respected nothing, and treated the place like his personal hotel. "Vivian, I think you're misunderstanding." "No, Dad. I understand perfectly." Her voice was rising now, taking on that edge I'd been hearing more often lately. "You can't accept that I'm married, that I chose someone, that my life doesn't revolve around making you happy anymore." The words landed between us like a grenade with the pin pulled. I felt my jaw unclench for the first time in months, not with defeat, but with something that felt suspiciously like relief. "That's not what this is about," I said. "Isn't it?" Ronan spoke up, his voice carrying a note of wounded righteousness that made my teeth clench. "Every day it's something new. The way I load the dishwasher, where I park my car, how long I spend looking for work. Nothing I do is good enough for the great man who built this house with his bare hands. Built this house with my bare hands." He said it like it was something to be ashamed of, like decades of hard work and sacrifice were somehow pretentious. I never said, "You don't have to say it," Vivian interrupted, her eyes flashing with an anger that seemed wildly disproportionate to asking someone to use a coaster. "It's in every look, every comment, every time you make him feel like he's not good enough for your precious daughter." I stared at her, this woman who used to be my little girl, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. She wasn't defending her husband from unreasonable treatment. She was attacking me for existing in my own space. "So here's how it's going to be," she said, crossing her arms in a gesture I remembered from her teenage years. "You better start respecting my husband, or you'll end up on the street." The words hung in the air like a slap. End up on the street. In my own house. After 40 years of mortgage payments, of maintaining every fixture, of working extra shifts to afford the renovations that made this place beautiful. I felt something snap inside me. Not break, but snap into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding where it belonged. I smiled. Not the broken smile of a defeated father, but something else entirely. Something that made Vivian take a small step back and Ronan's gaming sounds suddenly stop. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice carrying a calm that surprised even me, "for making this so much easier than I expected." The silence that followed felt different from the usual post-argument quiet. This wasn't the tense aftermath of another family dispute. This was the moment when the air pressure changes before a storm, when animals go silent and the sky turns an unnatural color. Vivian's face cycled through confusion, then irritation, then something that might have been the first flicker of uncertainty. "What's that supposed to mean?" I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up Ronan's mug, still dripping coffee onto my granite, and placed it carefully in the dishwasher. The soft click of ceramic against metal seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "It means," I said, closing the dishwasher with deliberate precision, "that you've just given me something I didn't know I needed." Ronan finally looked up from his phone, his earlier bravado flickering like a candle in wind. "What's that supposed to mean?" I opened the cabinet above the coffee maker and pulled out a small cardboard box I'd been saving for months, the replacement cartridges for the expensive water filter system I'd installed last year. The system that had added $40 to my monthly grocery bill but made the coffee taste better. Made everything taste better, actually. Permission, I said simply, and began removing the cartridges one by one, setting them on the counter with methodical precision. Permission for what? Vivienne's voice had lost its earlier fire, replaced by something that sounded almost like curiosity. I held up one of the cartridges to the light, examining it like it was something precious. Permission to stop pretending that any of this has been working. The next part happened in slow motion, at least in my memory. I walked to the expensive coffee maker, the one I'd bought after retirement to treat myself, the one that ground beans fresh for each cup, and unplugged it. Not dramatically, not angrily, just unplugged it. "Dad, what are you doing?" Vivienne asked, but she didn't move to stop me. I lifted the machine, all 15 pounds of Italian engineering, and carried it to the garage door. "Learning something about myself," I said, and set it down gently in the hallway. Ronan's phone had gone completely silent. He was staring at me like I'd sprouted a second head. I went back for the water filter cartridges. Then the expensive organic coffee beans I'd been buying from that little shop downtown. Then the ceramic coasters, all 12 of them, the ones I'd asked him to use exactly 4 times in 6 months. "You're being dramatic," Vivienne said, but her voice had gone small. "No," I said, carrying the last of the coffee supplies toward the garage. "Dramatic would be throwing these away. I'm just reorganizing." The beauty of the moment wasn't in what I was removing. It was in what I was choosing not to explain. I could see them both trying to decode my actions, searching for the pattern, the threat, the demand for apology. But there wasn't one. I was simply taking away the things that had become sources of conflict, removing the opportunities for daily negotiations about respect and consideration. "Where are you going with all that?" Ronan asked, and for the first time since they'd moved in, his voice held something that might have been genuine concern. I paused in the doorway to the garage, arms full of coffee-related items that had somehow become symbols of a battle I was tired of fighting. "Somewhere they'll be appreciated," I said. "Mrs. Patterson next door mentioned her coffee maker died last week. I think she'll enjoy these." I left them standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the sudden absence of things they'd never valued but had somehow assumed would always be there. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson tending her roses, probably wondering why her neighbor was approaching with an armload of coffee equipment and the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. Behind me, I heard Vivienne's voice. "What does this prove?" I didn't turn around. "That some problems solve themselves," I called back, "once you stop trying to fix them." The look on Mrs. Patterson's face when I explained I had some coffee equipment I wasn't using anymore was worth every awkward breakfast I'd endured watching Ronan ignore my perfectly reasonable requests. Her gratitude was immediate, uncomplicated, and real. When I walked back into my house 10 minutes later, Vivienne and Ronan were still standing exactly where I'd left them, but the entire atmosphere had changed. They looked like actors who'd forgotten their lines, standing on a stage where the scenery had been quietly rearranged while they weren't paying attention. "Okay," Vivienne said, crossing her arms in that particular way she'd inherited from her mother, the gesture of someone preparing to manage a difficult situation. "You've made your point. Very dramatic, very effective. Now can we get back to being adults?" The condescension in her voice hit me like a physical weight. Adults. As if I was the child in this scenario, as if my response to months of exploitation was somehow immature. I moved to the sink, taking my time washing my hands while I processed the shift in her tone. Gone was the uncertainty from earlier. This was the voice of someone who decided to call what she thought was a bluff. The water was cold against my skin, grounding me in the moment. "What point was that?" I asked, watching their reflections in the window above the sink. "The whole performance," Ronan said, and there was an edge in his voice now, the kind men use when they think another man is showing off for attention. His phone lay forgotten on the counter, which told me everything about how seriously he was taking this conversation. "Giving away your stuff, making mysterious comments. We get it. You're mad about the respect thing. Message received. Performance." Mad. They'd managed to reduce my actions to a tantrum that had run its course and could now be dismissed. I felt my jaw clench involuntarily, then forced it to relax. Control was everything now. And, I said, drying my hands with methodical precision. And now we move on, Vivienne continued, her voice warming with the confidence of someone who thought she'd successfully navigated a crisis. She even smiled, that bright, professional smile she used to close sales. We all learned something today. You got to express your feelings. We got to understand how serious you are about household courtesy. Everyone wins. The audacity took my breath away. My self-respect had become feelings. Months of exploitation had been reduced to household courtesy. And somehow, in her mind, everyone was supposed to win from a scenario where I'd been threatened with homelessness in my own house. "So we're good?" Ronan asked, and I could hear relief starting to creep into his voice, see his shoulders beginning to relax. No more dramatic gestures? Dramatic gestures. As if protecting my own interests was theater rather than necessity, I turned to face them fully, noting how they both straightened slightly when they saw my expression. "That depends," I said, and watched Vivienne's confident smile falter at the edges. "On what?" she asked, her voice suddenly more careful. I could feel my heartbeat steady and slow, the way it did when I was working on a difficult project and finally saw the solution clearly. "On whether you're planning to threaten me again." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vivienne's confident expression flickered like a candle in wind, and I saw her exchange a quick glance with Ronan, the kind of look that said they hadn't expected this conversation to go in this direction. "Dad, nobody threatened. You told me I'd end up on the street if I didn't show proper respect for your husband," I said quietly, and I could see the words land like physical blows. "In my own home. Those were your exact words." Vivienne's face went pale, then flushed red. "That was just, you were being impossible about everything. I was frustrated." Frustrated. The word she used to justify threatening her father with homelessness. I felt something cold and sharp settle behind my ribs. Not anger, exactly, but something cleaner and more dangerous. "And if you get frustrated again?" I asked. Ronan stepped forward slightly, his jaw tightening, and I could see him trying to reclaim control of the situation through physical presence. "Look, maybe everyone said things they didn't mean, but you can't hold one comment hostage forever." Hold hostage. Interesting choice of words from someone who'd been freeloading for 6 months. I let the irony hang in the air for a moment, watching his face as he realized what he just said. "I'm not holding anything hostage," I said, my voice steady as stone. "I'm just wondering what happens the next time you decide I'm not showing sufficient respect in my own home." "It won't happen again," Vivienne said quickly, and I could hear panic starting to thread through her voice. "We'll be more careful about how we communicate." More careful. Not more respectful. Just more careful about getting caught being disrespectful. The distinction was everything. "Good," I said, and let a smile touch the corners of my mouth. Not warm, not forgiving, but something that made them both take a small step back. "Because if either of you ever threatens me with eviction from my own property again, you'll discover exactly how fast someone can actually end up on the street." The silence that followed was different from their earlier discomfort. This was the silence of people realizing that the person they'd been managing might not be as manageable as they'd assumed. I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes, the moment when arrogance gave way to something that looked like genuine concern. "You can't be serious," Ronan said, but his voice had gone quiet, uncertain. "Try me," I said, and felt a kind of peace settle over me. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of finally standing on solid ground. Vivian's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, anger, something that might have been fear, before settling on indignation. "So what? You're threatening us now? That's your solution?" The accusation stung because it was so backwards, so perfectly upside down. "I'm not threatening anyone," I said, my voice calm as still water. "I'm explaining consequences. There's a difference." "This is insane," she said, her voice rising, and I could see tears starting to gather in her eyes, whether from anger or genuine distress, I couldn't tell. "You can't just kick out your own daughter because of one argument." One argument, as if months of systematic disrespect could be reduced to a single disagreement. "You're right," I agreed, and watched hope flicker across her face. I can't kick out my daughter because of one argument, but I can evict two adults who think they can threaten the homeowner with homelessness and then act surprised when he takes them seriously. We're family, Ronan said, his voice cracking slightly, and the word came out like a desperate prayer to a god who'd stopped listening. Family, I repeated thoughtfully, tasting the word. Is that what we're calling people who threaten to throw you out of your own home? Vivian's face flushed deep red, and I could see her hands shaking. You're being petty. You're being cruel. This isn't who you are. The words hit harder than I'd expected, not because they were true, but because they came from someone who'd once known me better than anyone. Maybe not, I said quietly, but it's who I'm becoming. And if you don't like this version of me, you're welcome to find somewhere else to live while I figure out who I want to be next. I could see the exact moment when they realized I wasn't bluffing, wasn't performing, wasn't having a breakdown they could manage. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The way their faces changed, the way their certainty crumbled into something raw and desperate. Fine, Vivienne said, her voice shaking with what might have been anger or something closer to panic. If that's how you want to play this, fine, but don't expect us to just disappear quietly. Don't expect this to be easy. The threat hung in the air between us, and I felt something settle in my chest like a key finding its lock. I don't expect anything to be easy, I said, but I expect it to be final. You have 30 days. 30 days? Ronan's voice cracked like a teenager's. 30 days, I confirmed, and watched their faces as the reality finally hit them. Starting now. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the smell. Bacon. Real bacon, not the cheap turkey substitute I'd been buying to stretch the grocery budget. The rich, familiar aroma drifted up from the kitchen, accompanied by the sound of eggs sizzling in a pan. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the domestic symphony below. Cabinet doors opening and closing, the gentle clink of dishes being set on the table. It sounded like the mornings from before, when breakfast was a shared ritual rather than a silent negotiation over who'd eaten what and when. But something felt wrong. Too orchestrated, too deliberate. I padded downstairs in my robe to find the kitchen transformed into a stage set of domestic harmony. Vivienne stood at the stove, still in her pajamas but with her hair carefully arranged, humming as she flipped bacon with practiced precision. Ronan sat at the table, actually dressed and showered before noon, reading what appeared to be a newspaper instead of staring at his phone. Morning, Dad. Vivienne's voice carried the forced brightness of someone auditioning for the role of perfect daughter. I made your favorite breakfast. Thought we could sit down together like we used to. Before they'd moved in and turned every meal into evidence of their entitlement. I could smell the manipulation along with the bacon, thick, greasy, and designed to make me hungry for something I'd lost. That's thoughtful, I said, settling into my usual chair, the one that had somehow become the least comfortable seat at my own table over the past months. Ronan looked up from his newspaper, actually the real estate section, I noticed, not the sports page, and offered what might have been the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. Hey, good morning. Vivian was up early, wanted to do something special. Something special. After threatening to throw me out of my own house yesterday, she was making breakfast. The psychology was almost admirable in its simplicity. Coffee's fresh, Vivian added, setting a plate in front of me with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for diffusing bombs. The good kind. I went to that little shop downtown you like. The good kind. The expensive beans I'd stopped buying months ago when their presence had doubled my grocery bills. She'd gone out early, spent money we both knew came from my account, to recreate a morning ritual that had died under the weight of their taking. I took a bite of the bacon. Perfect, of course. Crispy without being burnt, seasoned exactly the way I preferred it. The eggs were over easy, the yolks still runny, the toast golden brown. She'd remembered every detail of how I liked my breakfast, probably the first time she'd paid attention to my preferences in months. This is delicious, I said, and watched her face light up with something that might have been genuine pleasure if it wasn't so obviously calculated. I was thinking, she said, settling into her chair with the graceful movements of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Maybe we were all a little too emotional. A little too emotional. The phrase that reduced her threat to throw me out of my own house to a minor communication breakdown. Were we? I asked, cutting into my eggs and watching the yolk spread across the plate. I know I was, Ronan said, and I had to give him credit for the sincerity in his voice. I've been stressed about the job situation, taking it out on everyone around me. That's not fair to you. The job situation. 6 months of unemployment had become a situation temporary and external, rather than the result of his choices. And I think, Vivian continued, her voice taking on the careful cadence of someone delivering a prepared speech, maybe we all need to be more intentional about communication, about making sure everyone feels heard and respected. Intentional communication, feeling heard and respected. The language of self-help books and marriage counselors deployed like armor against the reality of what had happened. I ate my breakfast slowly, tasting each bite while I watched them perform their rehabilitation. The bacon really was perfect. The coffee was exactly the blend I preferred. The entire production was designed to remind me of what I could have if I just forgot about yesterday's threat and returned to being the accommodating father they'd grown comfortable exploiting. "This is nice," I said finally, setting down my fork. Very thoughtful. Hope bloomed on Vivienne's face. "So, we're okay? We can put yesterday behind us?" "Oh, we can definitely put yesterday behind us," I said, standing up and collecting my plate. "Right after we address what happens today." The hope flickered. "What do you mean?" I moved to the sink and began washing my dishes, a routine I'd maintained even when dirty plates multiplied around me like evidence of their presence. "I mean that breakfast was lovely, but it doesn't change the fact that you have 29 days left." "Dad, 29 days," I repeated, my voice steady as I dried the plate with methodical precision. "That's how long you have to find somewhere else to live." The silence that followed was different from yesterday's shock. This was the silence of people realizing that their strategy had failed before they'd even finished implementing it. "You can't be serious," Ronan said, his voice carrying a note of genuine disbelief. "One breakfast and you still want to throw us out?" "I don't want to throw you out," I said, hanging the dish towel on its hook with deliberate care. "I want you to honor the commitment you made when you threatened to throw me out." "That's not what happened," Vivian said quickly, "isn't it?" I turned to face them, noting how they'd both gone very still. "You said I'd end up on the street if I didn't show proper respect. I'm simply accepting your proposal and redirecting it to its proper target." "But we made breakfast," Vivian said as if domestic labor could erase threats. "Yes, you did, with my bacon, using my stove in my kitchen." I felt something cold and final settle behind my ribs. And it was delicious. Thank you. 29 days. I left them sitting at the table, surrounded by the remnants of their peace offering, and climbed the stairs to my bedroom. Through the thin walls, I could hear their voices rising in urgent conversation, the sound of people discovering that their understanding of the game had been fundamentally wrong. By the time I came back downstairs, showered and dressed, they were gone. The kitchen had been cleaned with the kind of thorough attention usually reserved for covering up crimes. Every dish washed, every surface spotless, even the bacon grease disposed of properly. But on the counter where my morning coffee usually waited, sat a single sheet of paper. Handwritten in Vivienne's careful script. "Dad, we're staying at Ronan's sister's place for a few days. We need time to think about what you really want from us. This isn't over. V." I read the note twice, feeling something that might have been amusement if it wasn't so bitter. They'd left to regroup, to strategize, to figure out how to manage me more effectively. The breakfast had been a probe, a test of whether domestic performance could reset our relationship to its previous dynamics. Now they knew it couldn't. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. Evidence, if I needed it, of their assumption that this was a negotiation rather than a conclusion. But first, I had a phone call to make. "Henderson Realty? Yes, I'd like to schedule that property evaluation we discussed. How soon can someone come out?" The real estate appraiser came and went Tuesday morning, spending an hour making notes about crown molding I'd installed myself and hardwood floors I'd refinished. "Exceptional condition," she'd said, "should move fast in this market." The preliminary numbers she quoted made 40 years of careful investment feel worth every sacrifice. I was still processing the validation when I heard the familiar rumble of Ronan's pickup truck. They were back sooner than I'd expected, probably having discovered that his sister's hospitality had limits they hadn't anticipated. But when the truck door opened, it wasn't just Vivienne and Ronan who emerged. A third figure unfolded from the passenger seat, a woman I recognized but hadn't seen in over a year. Diane, Vivienne's mother. My ex-wife, wearing the kind of carefully composed expression that suggested she'd been recruited for this particular mission. My stomach dropped, not because I feared her. Our divorce had been finalized 8 years ago with all the passion of a business transaction, but because her presence meant they'd escalated beyond family conflict into something more strategic. "Hello, Richard," Diane said, her voice carrying the forced warmth of someone who'd practiced this greeting. "You look well." I looked well. After 8 years of divorce and 2 years of minimal contact, that was her opening gambit. Not an acknowledgement of the situation that had brought her here, not an explanation for her presence, just a pleasantry designed to establish normal social dynamics. "Diane," I said, "this is unexpected. Vivienne called me yesterday. She's very concerned about you." Diane moved closer to the porch, her designer heels clicking against the walkway I'd poured and finished myself. "About this situation you're all dealing with." Situation. The same word Ronan had used to describe his unemployment, now applied to their threat to throw me out of my own home. "What situation is that?" I asked. "Oh, Richard." Her voice carried that particular tone of gentle condescension she'd perfected during our marriage, the sound of someone explaining the obvious to someone too stubborn to see it. Vivienne told me about the eviction threats, the paranoia about money. "Honey, this isn't like you. Paranoia about money. Eviction threats." Vivienne had painted herself as the victim even to her mother, someone who'd abandoned her at 15 and maintained only sporadic contact since. "And what exactly did Vivienne tell you?" I asked. Diane glanced back at the truck, where Vivienne and Ronan sat watching our conversation like directors observing a crucial scene. She said, "You've been having some kind of breakdown since retirement, making wild accusations about them taking advantage, threatening to kick them out over minor disagreements." Wild accusations, minor disagreements, the same narrative they'd been building, now delivered by someone whose authority was supposed to override my version of events. "I see," I said. "The thing is," Diane continued, stepping closer with the practiced intimacy of someone who'd once shared my bed and thought that gave her permanent access to my psychology, "I know you. You're not the kind of man who throws family out on the street. You're not cruel. Not cruel." The implication being that my current behavior was an aberration, a departure from my true nature that could be corrected with the right intervention. "You're absolutely right," I said, and watched hope flicker across her face. "I'm not cruel, which is why I gave them 30 days instead of the 24 hours they deserved." The hope died. "Richard, did Vivienne mention that she threatened to put me on the street if I didn't show proper respect for her husband? In my own house, Diane. The house I've been paying for alone while they've been spending my money like lottery winners." Diane's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment. A crack in the facade that suggested Vivienne's version of events had omitted crucial details. "I'm sure there's more to it than that," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I'm sure there is too," I agreed. "Would you like to see the credit card statements? The utility bills? The grocery receipts? I have documentation going back 6 months." "That's not necessary. Or maybe you'd prefer to hear about how they've contributed exactly $0 to household expenses while charging thousands to my accounts, how Ronan's been unemployed for 6 months but somehow always has money for gaming subscriptions and restaurant meals." Each fact landed like a stone in still water, and I could see Diane processing information that didn't match the story she'd been told. "Vivienne said they were helping with expenses," she said quietly. "Vivienne said a lot of things, very few of them were true." The silence that followed felt different from the usual post-argument quiet. This was the silence of someone realizing they'd been recruited for a mission based on false intelligence. Diane glanced back at the truck again, where I could see Vivienne gesturing urgently through the windshield, probably trying to communicate some signal or strategy. Maybe I should talk to her, Diane said. Maybe you should, I agreed. And while you're at it, ask her why she thought bringing her estranged mother into a situation where she's been systematically exploiting her father was a good idea. Diane's face flushed. I'm not estranged. When was the last time you called your daughter before yesterday? I asked. When was the last time you sent a birthday card, a Christmas gift, any indication that you remembered she existed? The answer was written across her face. Months, maybe longer. Vivienne had reached out to a mother who'd been absent for most of her adult life, probably because she'd run out of local allies willing to support her narrative. I think I should go, Diane said quietly. I think that's best, I agreed. I watched her walk back to the truck, watched the urgent conversation that followed through the windshield, watched as realization dawned on Vivienne's face that her mother's intervention had backfired spectacularly. The truck pulled away 5 minutes later, leaving me alone on my porch with the taste of vindication and something sadder, the recognition that my daughter had been willing to weaponize every relationship in her life rather than acknowledge her own behavior. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet Morrison. Final appraisal attached. Excellent market position. Ready to list when you are. I typed back, listed immediately. 28 days and counting. On day 28, they came with witnesses. I opened the door to find not just Vivienne and Ronan, but a small crowd assembled on my porch, like some kind of intervention committee. Mrs. Henderson from 2 houses down, Jim Martinez from across the street, even old Pete from the corner house, who I'd helped with his roof last spring. My neighbors, people I'd known for years, all wearing the uncomfortable expressions of people who'd been told they were doing the right thing, but weren't entirely sure they believed it. Richard, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. We need to talk. I looked past her to Vivienne, who stood behind the group with the satisfied expression of someone who'd finally found the right weapon. She'd weaponized my own community against me. About what? I asked. About what's been happening with your family, Jim said, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Vivienne came by yesterday. She's very worried about you. Of course, she had. When legal threats and emotional manipulation failed, recruit the neighbors. Turn my self-protection into evidence of my instability, witnessed by people whose opinions mattered to me. I see, I said. And what exactly did she tell you? Mrs. Henderson glanced back at Vivienne, then faced me with the determined expression of someone who'd been convinced she was performing a rescue. She said, You've been acting erratically since retirement, threatening to throw them out without cause, making wild accusations about money. Wild accusations. Without cause. The same narrative now endorsed by people I respected. She showed us some concerning behavior patterns, Pete added, his weathered hands fidgeting with his hat, giving away expensive equipment for no reason, sudden personality changes, signs of cognitive decline. Cognitive decline. They'd convinced my neighbors that my self-respect was actually dementia. And you all believe this? I asked. We believe, Jim said carefully, that sometimes people need help seeing when they're not thinking clearly. Retirement can be hard on a man. Isolation, depression, confusion about relationships. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, but a kind of crystalline disappointment. These were people who'd known me for decades, who'd borrowed my tools and shared holiday dinners, and they'd been turned against me by a woman who'd spent 6 months systematically exploiting my generosity. That's thoughtful of you all, I said, very community-minded. We just want to help, Mrs. Henderson said. Maybe we could all sit down together, work out some kind of arrangement that makes everyone comfortable. An arrangement. Mediated by my neighbors, designed to pressure me into accepting continued exploitation under the guise of family harmony. Before we do that, I said, would you like to see something? I disappeared into my study and returned with the thick folder I'd been organizing for weeks. Financial documents, bank statements, credit card bills, 6 months of evidence spread across multiple manila folders. This is what Vivienne calls wild accusations, I said, handing the first folder to Mrs. Henderson. She opened it, her expression shifting from concern to confusion to something approaching shock as she read. Jim peered over her shoulder, his face darkening with each page. Jesus, Pete whispered, looking at a credit card statement showing $1,247 in restaurant charges for a single month. They spent this much on food while contributing exactly $0 to household expenses, I confirmed. 6 months, $15,000 in costs, not counting rent or utilities. I watched my neighbors process the information, their faces cycling through the same realization I'd had months ago, that generosity and exploitation weren't the same thing. But Vivienne said they were helping with expenses, Mrs. Henderson said weakly. Did she? I asked. Or did she say they were contributing and let you assume that meant money? The silence that followed was different from their earlier certainty. This was the silence of people realizing they'd been manipulated into supporting something they didn't understand. There's more, I said, pulling out my phone. Would you like to hear her threaten to throw me out of my own house if I didn't show proper respect for her unemployed husband? I played the recording. Vivienne's voice, clear and unmistakable, telling me I'd end up on the street if I didn't submit to her demands. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore or reinterpret. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. She threatened you? In my own kitchen. About asking her husband to use a coaster. I watched my neighbors look at Vivienne with new eyes, not as a concerned daughter trying to help her struggling father, but as someone who'd lied to them, used them, turned them into unwitting participants in her manipulation. I think we should go, Jim said quietly. I think that's best, I agreed. One by one, they left, Mrs. Henderson pausing to squeeze my shoulder with genuine remorse, Pete muttering apologies under his breath, Jim shooting Vivienne a look that could have curdled milk. Soon it was just the three of us on my porch. Vivienne, Ronan, and me. The family that wasn't a family anymore, stripped of witnesses and allies and protective narratives. You turned them against us, Vivienne said, her voice shaking with something between anger and desperation. No, I said quietly. I told them the truth. You turned them against yourselves. We have nowhere to go, Ronan said, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice carried genuine vulnerability instead of entitled expectation. You have exactly where you had before you moved in here, I said. Wherever that was. Dad, please. You brought my neighbors to my door to pressure me into accepting continued exploitation, I said, feeling something final settle behind my ribs. You turned people I've known for 20 years into weapons against me. What exactly did you think would happen? We're desperate, she whispered. Yes, I agreed. You are, and that's exactly what you should be. I closed the door on them for the last time, listening to their voices fade as they walked back to their truck. Through my window, I watched them drive away, not to pack their remaining belongings, but to face whatever consequences came from having no backup plan beyond continued exploitation. That evening, I called my brother in Arizona. Michael, that guest house still available? I think I'm ready for that new chapter. His laughter was warm and immediate. I've been waiting for this call for months. When can you get here? Soon as I can sell the house. The next morning, I found a business card tucked under my windshield wiper. Henderson Realty. Written on the back in Vivienne's handwriting, please call us. We can work something out. I tore it into small pieces and let the wind scatter them across the lawn I'd maintained for 40 years. Some relationships, once broken, weren't meant to be repaired. They were meant to be survived. If you enjoyed this story, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And when you're ready for the next story, just click the box on the left. Thanks for watching.